Being joined by Kathy Shulkin and Andrea Tottossy today, and I'll take some time in just a minute to introduce myself and my other colleagues. Obviously, you're here today because you'd like to learn more about the Common Core state standards and what's coming up with these next generation assessments. And so we're going to do our best to provide you as much information as possible in approximately 45 minutes. If you're looking for more in-depth information, please check out our next generation assessment summits coming up. It's our Common Core State Standards Summit version 2.0. Next one, July 10th and 11th in St. Louis, and then another one August 13th and 14th in San Diego. Pick your destination. If you'd like to learn more about those, please feel free to email Brooke Little at hmhco.com for more information about those upcoming conferences. We, in addition to that, have an upcoming event featuring the author Paul Tough. You may be familiar with his work about the Harlem Children's Zone and some of the outstanding work that's being done around the country by schools just like yours and beating the odds for our neediest kids. He will be joining us for a two-day summit on next generation instructional practices, June 26th and 27th in Denver, Colorado, with several of our colleagues that you see listed there who, like Andrea and myself, spend 90% of our time out in the field with people just like you, working through the issues that you're facing on a daily basis. Again, for more information about that upcoming event, please contact Brooke Little at the address that you see there on your screen. Couple of publications that you might find useful as you are thinking about making these educational shifts or transformations to the new Common Core state standards. Larry Ainsworth is the author of Rigorous Curriculum Design, which is a process that he created and that we share with educators across the world, really in thinking about how to adjust and plan for a rigorous curriculum based on these new standards. What you'll see in his most recent book, featured on the screen here, Getting Started with Rigorous Curriculum Design, are the stories of 9 districts just like yours that have begun this process and kind of the how-to behind the scenes. So if you'd like to learn more about the process itself, check out Larry's book, Rigorous Curriculum Design. If you'd like to know about how other districts just like yours have gone about getting this work started and their journeys along the way, I'd urge you to check this publication out. Brand new, coming out, available in June of this year, and available for pre-orders now, is Larry's new book on prioritizing the Common Core. And universally, Fordham Institute and others have rated the new Common Core standards as being superior to all but 2 of the 50 states. One thing that's been overlooked, though, is the need to still prioritize the curriculum. So while those standards are greater in specificity and detail, educators need to know which are most important and will contribute most to our students' success. And so Larry will give you step-by-step directions as well as profiles of clients in 6 different states and how they've gone about prioritizing the Common Core. Those prioritized standards then become the focus of our units of instruction, our assessment, and our collaboration around them. It's not an elimination, but a prioritization, what's most important. An additional resource just coming out in August of this year, and folks, if you are struggling with and worrying about how you're going to meet the challenges of the new math standards, I cannot recommend Jan Christensen's book highly enough. On the screen it says it's a follow-up resource. I had a conversation with Jan the other day, and it is also a standalone. It is a book and a DVD set that talks about practical ways to implement the Common Core math. And folks, the process standards that we're looking at in Common Core are absolutely enormous, and Jan's going to give you lots of practical information on nuts and bolts for how to make those come alive in your math classrooms, in your buildings. I have a personal story related to it here. I attended a session with Larry Ainsworth on balanced mathematics instruction and really felt like I began to teach math the next day after attending that. And in large part, I credit what I learned in that seminar from going from 45% of my students passing my state assessment as a classroom teacher to the next year only 1 student failing. Cannot recommend this resource highly enough to you. Okay, your presenters today are myself, Tony Flach. I am a professional development associate at the Leadership and Learning Center. Been I'm formerly with Norfolk Public Schools, where I met Andrea Tottossy. Andrea is a former principal who began her career as a middle school math and reading teacher. She worked in Norfolk, which is a large urban school district, and held a variety of positions all the way up through principal of one of the largest high schools in the district. Her high school has been recognized as one of the top high schools in the United States by Newsweek magazine, and we were lucky enough to steal her off and join us about 2 years ago. So glad to welcome Andrea on board with us today. And Kathy Shulkin is our Senior Marketing Manager, and she'll be helping field some of the questions and keep us on track. And if you have any questions about resources and materials. Jen sent a question in regarding the book on balancing mathematics, and it is a K-12 focus there. We also have additional resources for specific grade levels. All right, so folks, we're going to jump right into the content now. Thanks for your patience there. Quick question from Doug regarding which two states. Yeah, that's always the question, so Doug, it'll be interesting to find out if you're in one of those two states that were rated equal to Common Core. According to the Fordham Institute, those two states were Massachusetts and California, and depending on the content area, they were either rated equal to or slightly better than the Common Core standards. And if you'd like more information on that study, please contact us towards the end of the webinar, and we'll be glad to send you those references and resources. Okay, so Kathy's going to launch a poll question for you here, and I'm going to turn it over to Andrea at this point to solicit your responses and respond to the information that you provide us. Andrea.
Well, good morning, everyone. Tony, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I just want to make sure I had my mute button properly pushed. Good morning, everyone. Just want to thank you guys for joining us today. I am absolutely thrilled to be here with you and to talk with folks about what's coming up with these next generation assessments. And as I was preparing for this webinar, I was just reflecting on, where we are in the time frame with Common Core. And if we think about those standards having been released in 2010 and those next generation assessments starting in 2014, and knowing that we are here at 2013, we are well past halftime. So there is an enormous sense of urgency for us to really be thinking about the shifts required in our instruction and what we're doing with curriculum and how all that matches up to these enormous next generation assessments. So knowing that the consortia were awarded grant money from the US DOE for Race to the Top, and they've developed two separate consortia of assessments. There's the PARCC and there's the Smarter Balanced. We're just curious to see where your current levels of understanding are. So if you could look at letters A through D and think carefully about your own personal anonymous levels of preparation regarding your knowledge of the next generation assessments. And you'll see that they range in many different places. So just choose the one that best suits you. Let's see if this matches what our general work is as we work across the country.
And I think we will see a very strong trend coming up, and I'm going to close the poll in 5 seconds. And I'm sharing the results.
Okay, so it looks like most folks in this scenario have chosen B, which is that they're aware of the shifts in instruction. Very few have selected A, which is that they're checking those PARCC and Smarter Balanced Consortia websites daily. The middle, I guess in between those two would be we're aware that we have to make some changes, but not sure what they are. And then very few, not even sure what state, what consortia your state belongs to. So it's good to know that folks are aware that there are shifts in instruction and there are some necessary things that absolutely have to happen for our students to be successful on these next generation assessments. So knowing that information, that'll help Tony and I as we move forward through the webinars so that we can be sure that we address your needs specifically. So our learning intentions for today are really about thinking about the assessments. What are the effects that they're going to have for us in terms of teaching, in terms of how we assess our students? What does our mind shift as teachers and leaders have to be? Knowing where we need to land, what do we have to do now to get there? And once we figure that out and we focus on that a bit, then we can think about, okay, what are then these best practices in both teaching and leadership around formative assessment and data analysis so that we can prepare our students in the best possible way for preparedness for the next generation assessments that are starting in 2014 and 15 school year. So in order for us to really think about how we start moving forward, and everybody wants to jump in and dive in and get into these Common Core standards and what's assessment look like, we have to slow down a little bit first. We have to slow down before we can go fast. And we know that the Common Core state standards and the next generation accountability have caused us really to give pause and consider the shifts in instruction that are necessary for the Common Core state standards and readiness. Just as an example, in English language arts, there are 6 shifts in instruction that are absolutely necessary for our students to be successful. These are shifts in mindset that our teachers have to really think about as they approach instruction each and every day. And they include things like text complexity, increased reading of informational text, academic vocabulary, text-based answers, an increase in writing from sources, as well as literacy instruction in all content areas. And we know that those English language arts standards beginning in 6th grade do reach out into science, social studies, and technical subjects. And in mathematics, one of the biggest shifts that we have to make is really developing a mindset around modeling and real-world problems. So some of the shifts that we have to think about as mathematics teachers are focus. What does the laser-like focus on those standards look like? The issue of coherence. How do those standards and those trajectories progress across grade levels, and what does it mean for students in instruction? Mathematical fluency. How do we get students to a place where they're fluent in mathematics? And what we found and what research tells us is that we really have to focus on the conceptual understandings, and the Common Core gives us those standards for students K3 and K4. Developing a deep understanding in math, application of math, that's the whole modeling and real-world scenario piece, as well as having a focus on dual intensity, which that means striking a balance between conceptual understanding and procedural fluency. And that whole balance of the teaching of math is a major high point of Jan Christensen's work with the 5 easy steps and the balanced instruction in math. So Tony, if you'd like to pick up with the today's state assessments piece, we can move on.
Yeah, and those challenges, Andrea, those changes, transitions that you've referenced in the classroom, the folks that we're working with in the field are finding that problematic in many aspects because a lot of materials and resources that they have out there don't match up to the demands placed on students and on educators now by these new standards. So, you know, you mentioned the nonfiction reading piece, and one school that I'm working with very in-depth this year has really found it difficult to find high-quality literature. That has implications for our assessments that we're transitioning away from, and those assessments that we're going to think about and be facing under the new state standards, the new Common Core standards. Currently, folks, you all know this, so we're in the middle of the silly season of testing right now, but most of our state assessments rely on multiple choice items. Bubble in the answers and go from there. And a good friend of mine actually made it through high school physics with really just a random distribution of answers on his bubble sheets. So, you know, they're not necessarily getting at real understanding of the content and skills that we're trying to measure. Only a few states currently, like Connecticut, Indiana, and Maryland, actually have short constructed response as a part of their state-level assessments. Got a quick note from Barbara. She said that the sound keeps cutting off. Folks, if you could send the chat, just a note in via the chat function, and let us know if your sound is still going okay from there, and I know Kathy will check into that real quick. Folks, as it says on the screen, our current assessments, looks like, okay, most of the sound seems to be okay. Thanks, folks. Appreciate that response. So currently, our English language arts assessments, our math assessments, often fail to capture that full spectrum of what our kids really know and can do. And that's what these new assessments are looking to do. These next generation assessments, folks, and this is going to be unique for a lot of us, are really trying to measure what our kids think, as well as providing us with evidence. Rather than being a snapshot of a single moment in time, they're going to provide us evidence of student growth over time as we go throughout. So how did our kids do from one year to another? What's their progression throughout the year? How are they doing against the learning progressions that are represented in the standards? And Andrea's going to go into more detail in subsequent slides. But folks, if you haven't already, those of you that say you're checking out the PARCC and Smarter Balanced Consortia websites on a semi-regular basis, I'd urge you to really dig into those sample assessment items, as well as the blueprint and technical specifications for the assessment items. What we're talking about here, folks, are not no-brainer kind of responses. These are really going to be high in a level of cognitive demand that they place on our students. Was just recently working with a group of principals who was getting their first look at these assessment items, and it's kind of funny. To put up a 6th grade passage and the questions related to that passage, and it was a short constructed response, and gave the principals an opportunity to take a look at it for a few minutes, and we were all kind of stumped by it. There were a variety of really good answers to the question, so there wasn't one clear best answer, but a lot of good answers, and took a while to justify our responses. There's a quote on the screen here from Arne Duncan. You may know him as the Secretary of Education. Let me give you just a minute to read through that, and then I'll hit some key points from it. So folks, as I read this, and we can give you the reference for the full speech if you'd like to go check it out, and send us an email afterwards. But a couple of things just leap off the screen at me. Here's the Secretary of Education talking about an absolute game changer. These are really, as the name implies, the next generation of how we're going to measure students' knowledge and skills. The beauty of this is we now, for the first time, as the Fordham Institute and others have found in their review of the standards, have a clear continuum of progress from kindergarten up through college and career readiness. And so schools, classrooms, and districts will be able to know in a very accurate manner how our students are doing on being on track for college and career readiness. And what's interesting, folks, we got a question from Connie in the audience, and knowing more about how the Common Core State Standard assessments will be handled in regards to ESOL students and special education students. Andrea?
Thank you, Tony. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, so I do have some information in response to the question about the accommodations for students with disabilities and ELL students. The PARCC Consortium has on their website a draft accommodations manual. It was just released very, very recently, and it talks about how those items will be selected, administered, and evaluated, as well as the tools and accommodations for students and the assessment of students with disabilities and English learners. So there is some information out there. They also, PARCC has a frequently asked questions page in their website that just came up April of 2013. So there's information out there. It's pretty specific, but basically what PARCC intends to do is by assessing students on computer devices, they're saying that the PARCC states will have the opportunity to provide all students with the tools that they frequently use in the classroom and daily life. And these are tools that at one time were only provided as accommodations, but we're talking about highlighters and a large font. These tools will be readily available within the context of the assessment. Now, Smarter Balanced, on the other hand, they also have information on their website as well, and they will provide for accurate measures of achievement and growth for students with disabilities. So, you know, again, this whole growth mindset. And their assessments will address visual, auditory, and physical access barriers so that virtually all students will be able to demonstrate what they know and what they're able to do. And Smarter Balanced on their website has information about the research-based accessibility features and accommodation options for students with disabilities and English language learners. And they do have an accommodations framework that has been published as well. So that's in a nutshell what each consortia has done, but there is more information on their websites. And if you have questions about how to find those, just email me and I can send you the links to those anytime.
And Andrea, there,
yes.
A question just came in, actually 2 questions. And first one, actually, Kathy, I'm going to send over to you. Laura just asked if participants are able to see the questions that others submit. So, Kathy, I don't know if there's a way to do that. We depend on your technical expertise there.
Unfortunately, Tony, no, the audience cannot see the questions, but we are doing our best to get to all of them and answer them as they come in.
Okay, great. And so on that note, we did, Andrea, receive a follow-up question. Will PARCC or Smarter Balance use adaptive texts? And that question came in from Mary. I think you addressed that somewhat, but could you give us a little more detail on that?
Yeah, the specificity on adapted text. Now, we know that those college and career readiness anchor standards are really addressed about students being able to read on grade level by the end of their each grade as they go on the trajectory K-12. So we can anticipate that those texts will be at grade level. Now, I would have to find that for sure on the website and what that looks like in terms of level text, but I know that Smarter Balanced is using a computer adapted technology, which means that as students ask questions, the way that they answer predicts what the next question will be. So they're able, through Smarter Balance, to scaffold a bit to provide more specific data to teachers and principals and leaders and parents about where specific areas are for students where they have grown or where they need to show growth. So more information on that, I'm sure, is available, but you know, if there's follow-up questions on that, I'm sure we could find the information.
Yeah, and Andrea, sorry, I may have misrepresented the question. Mary writes in adaptive rather than adapted. Text change reading levels on the fly.
So where that might be seen is in Smarter Balance, but I would have to check and see if the texts are leveled, if that adaptivity reaches out to the text. I'm not sure if it's the text or the questions. We can find that information out.
Okay, great.
And there's one other that Connie has asked as a follow-up about sending the links regarding, Andrea, your discussion, and I do believe that we will be including those links with the PowerPoint download that you'll be able to access on Monday from our website.
Okay. Yep, I'm writing a note to make sure that those are included. I think we have already, but I'll make sure that that's in there for certain. Those are really important documents, so we want to make sure folks are able to access those.
All right, and a question from Lois at this point as we're transitioning to more detail. Lois asks, how will the pass scores be determined for these tests that indicate whether students will be able to graduate from high school?
I would probably need more clarification on that. I'm not sure what we mean by pass tests. As we know, different states have different graduation criteria, so I'd be interested maybe having a conversation with Lois just to find out exactly what the scope of that question is. I'm not certain what that means just by the way it was written. I apologize. I might be just misunderstanding.
Okay. All right, and we've got a couple more questions coming in, and we'll try to stage those out over the balance of the webinar. So,
okay.
Thanks, Andrea. Go ahead. Keep moving.
Okay. Thank you. So we know that the next generation assessments are going to measure math and ELA, and they will assess those in grades 3 through 8, and also at least once in high school. And what that looks like for PARCC is in grades 9 through 11, they will be assessed in ELA, and they will also be assessed in PARCC, and of course in Algebra, Geometry, and Algebra 2. For Smarter Balanced in high school, it's grade 11 only, so there's a bit of a difference there. So it's really important for participants to know to which consortia their state belongs. Also, PARCC and Smarter Balanced have given us a gift, really, which is optional assessments throughout the year. So, you know, as we teach at the center and just best practices in assessment, you know, we don't want to be doing the autopsy at the end of the year. We want to be collecting formative data as we go across the year. So PARCC has given us optional assessments, an optional diagnostic, and an optional mid-year for grades 3 through 8 and high school. And Smarter Balance has given us optional interim assessments at grades 3 through 12, and they've included performance tasks. So there are really great opportunities along the way for us to assess where our students are on that trajectory to college and career readiness. So some of the features of the next generation assessments, they combine on-demand technology administered items, which would be the selected response items where students choose from an item that is there for them, whether it's multiple choice or a true false or fill in the blank. It's where the selections are already there. But those are combined with extended performance tasks and, as Tony mentioned earlier, those shorter constructed response items in both math and ELA. And what we have to know as teachers and leaders is this. The big change with these assessments is that the target is the thinking of the students. How do we endeavor to assess what the students are thinking? And we can't wait for the students to be exposed to that type of questioning in 14 and 15 when they're looking at the next generation assessments. We have to shift and address these issues now in our classroom with not only how we formally and informally assess our students in their work, but also how we question them. How are we as teachers getting at the thinking of our students? And that is just so important. So when we're looking at some more of those features, we know that there are examples on both of the websites. And if you guys, if you haven't seen these, you've got to check them out. Tony, I know you mentioned your experience in showing some released items to some leaders and their I could use the word shock when they see them.
Yes, it was.
That's my consistent experience in working with many districts across the country as we help districts, become better at assessment, whether it's common formative assessment or whether we're helping folks with those authentic performance tasks, or even when we're writing curriculum. Oftentimes, I will show some of those released items that are appropriate, of course, for the grade level in the state. But folks are always blown away when we really look at those assessments and what they're going after. So just some examples. In math, for example, the students may be given a data table from an experiment. So we've got a chart up there of data under certain conditions. And then, they'll answer some questions, some of those selected response, and then the data will change, perhaps for a follow-up question. So then the students have to reanalyze that data in a totally new setting. So they have to take the thinking that they accessed initially and apply it at a much higher, deeper level in a whole new setting. And, oh, by the way, most likely have to provide a justification for their solution. So this is a big monster shift in how we're assessing students. Another example for English language arts that I love to share, it's a 7th grade example where students would read text about Amelia Earhart. And I think all of us have knowledge we can access about Amelia Earhart. We all know she's brave. We all know she's courageous. So the question is not, is Amelia Earhart brave and courageous? We know that. What the students would have to do in 7th grade is read 3 different texts about Amelia Earhart. And they would have to consider the argument of the authors and how they portrayed her as being brave and courageous. So again, they're looking at how the author portrayed. So their task would be to write an essay analyzing the strengths of the arguments of the authors, completely different from the way that we have held students accountable for their learning. And those of you who are Smarter Balanced states, I have to tell you that just yesterday, Smarter Balanced released online practice tests. So if you're one of those states that belongs to the Smarter Balanced Consortium, it's a 26-state consortium. You now have access to online practice tests. They just were released yesterday. So Tony, back to you about those selected response items.
And we received a question from Kathy. She was asking for some clarification about the high school test in both Smarter Balanced and PARCC consortia. What she writes is that the grade course in high school that is tested is what she's looking for. She heard you mention 11th grade, but not whether or not if it is up to the districts to test every high school grade, since it's required for grades 3 through 8. So can you give us a little more information about the high school?
Yeah, I would suggest that she consult with her high school exactly, or her district, about exactly what their plans are for the assessment. These are the assessments that will be available, and it's anticipated that they will be utilized. So she may want to speak with her district specifically about what their plans are, and in particular around those optional assessments, what they plan to do with those.
Gotcha. And 2 quick questions here, and then we'll talk about individual item types. Lois asks if we know when PARCC will be releasing sample items. And Andrea, I know I've seen several sample items.
They've been released
on PARCC.
Yeah, PARCC has.
Put a test out?
Yeah, PARCC has sample items released now. They've been out for some time. So if you go to the PARCC website, they're called prototype. So sample prototype items, if you click on that, I think it's on the main page towards the middle of the front home page. You'll find that information. But they're called prototypes, and there's a lot on there.
And quick question from Tony. Good name there, Tony.
Is that
there
you?
are rumors of both. Yeah, no, it wasn't me. There were rumors of both consortia being combined. Have you heard anything in regards to that? And then we'll go to talk about individual items.
That's a really interesting question, because they're both moving, towards assessment on the standards. And actually, and I failed to mention this earlier, but around the issue of students with disabilities and English language learners, they are working together in that vein to provide some consistency in regard to those 2 areas. So, the major difference that we see, Tony, between the 2 is the computer adaptive testing with Smarter Balanced. We have looked at released items from both and have looked at the blueprints and the content frameworks. And one thing that is clearly evident to us in our analysis is the depth and the rigor and how these standards will be assessed for students. So we know that is going to be very consistent. We know both consortia are using selected response, constructed response, extended performance tasks, but the Smarter Balanced states do have those computer adapted items.
All right, awesome.
That's the
Thanks,
big
Andrea.
difference. Sure.
So selected response items, folks, these are the ones we're the most familiar with. We've seen them ad nauseum, both in our own educational career as well as what we were subjected to as students. And so these have been defined as, what we know traditionally as multiple choice. There's a stimulus and a STEM, followed by between 3 to 5 options. So what's different about the next generation assessment items? Folks, tell you, like Andrea said, go check out the samples. What's really interesting, my wife and I were taking a look. My wife is an educator in North Carolina, where we live, and we were taking a look just for our own information. And we found a sample item on fractions, and my wife taught 5th grade math, so she was really interested in that. And we were reading through the item, and looked like a pretty straightforward multiple choice item. There was a number line presented, and then identified the appropriate fraction represented on it. What we realized was that what was required by the item was not selecting the right answer, but determining whether each of the presented items was actually true or false. So it looked like a traditional selected response item, but it was actually far more detailed than that. Other items that we've seen as we do this work with schools around the country are multiple choice items in which students have to select an answer and then go on to justify it in more of a constructed response afterwards. But what's different about the selected response portion of that item is that there are 2 or 3 answers that could be right depending on the process by which the students arrive at the answer. So if they approach the problem in this particular way, I remember the one item about golf balls in a graduated cylinder. If you approach it in this way, then you could potentially, the answer could be 3, 5, or 7, if I'm remembering correctly, as right answers, but it all is dependent on how the student justifies the response, shows their thinking, and explains the thought processes behind it. Constructed response items, and when I click the button, the slide's supposed to advance. There we go. Main purpose here is to address those targets and claims that are of greater depth, greater complexity required in the thinking. Of course, as the name suggests, there's no possible answer choices there, and so students are required to develop their answers, defend their responses. The sample that Andrea mentioned before. Another item I just looked at last week with a group of principals, we had to go back into a passage and pull out, as part of a constructed response, words and phrases from that passage that the author used to create a certain mood or tone in the passage. And so again, this is different than what we've seen previously, where students would be either asked, so what's the mood created in this passage, and given 4 choices, or which of the following words or phrases added to the mood. In this case, they had to actually go back to the passage, return to the text box in which they were constructing their response, and type in their responses. Andrea, other thoughts here that you've seen about some of these pieces? Did we lose Andrea?
Sorry, I started talking and the mute was on. The big thing for me, I know, I said a lot of great, no, just kidding. And just my analysis and you know, really wanting to help people understand about these assessments so we can better help kids. The level of thinking required, and it's incumbent and important for us to also, as a sidebar, do some professional development learning around the depth of knowledge, the DOK levels of the items and the standards, and you know, not just looking at the skill that the students have to do in the standard, but pairing that with the concept and really looking at the cognitive load of the combination of those two together. Because when you really think about that and what it looks like in terms of an assessment item, we're really trying to access and help teachers understand that those items are accessing the thinking of the students. So hence what we're seeing is a stronger plausibility of answers. You know, you may see choose the best item, where many of those items are indeed plausible. So it's which is the most plausible. Or we'll see items where there are more than one correct answer. And students have to know it's okay in certain places to choose more than one, depending on what the directions say. And Tony, I cannot punctuate enough your example, the math example, of a different answer being accepted based on the justification. That is powerful. And it's so different from what we're used to doing with our students. And for teachers, you know, just to think about, how are we asking questions of students? You know, as math teachers, are we providing scenarios to our students that allow for multiple entry points, multiple access points into the problem? And are we accepting of different answers? And all that comes through in Jan Christensen's work with the balanced math instruction. It's a component that we teach, but it's something that we must be thinking about, which leads me to talk about the performance tests. And you know, these are extended opportunities for students to basically show what they know. That's, in a nutshell, they're showing what they know, and they have to make some sort of application, analysis, use of what they have learned. So in math, what that might look like is the manipulation of data, followed by a justification or an error analysis, some type of real-world setting. And students will have to demonstrate their knowledge and skills across multiple standards. So if you look at the released items, you'll see they're not just assessing one standard, it's multiple standards. And even in mathematics, we'll see multiple grade level standards pulled in to one performance task. And what that might look like in ELA, students will generally have to read one or more texts. Then they will have to answer some short comprehension or vocabulary questions, and then write an essay based on evidence. And argumentative writing is huge in the Common Core, and it starts in kindergarten. So if you're familiar with the standards in ELA, you'll see in kindergarten, elementary school, it's called opinion. But when we get to secondary school, it becomes argumentative writing. It's a trajectory that's K-12. And students will be expected to do research simulations, conduct literary analysis, and also engage in narrative tasks. So it's quite comprehensive, and there is much, much, much for us to learn and teach about the next generation assessments. So let's think about moving forward. And I know Tony and I have shared a lot of information with you today, many that on the surface, but absolutely critical information, and there's much, much more to learn. So as a former principal and teacher, you know, I put myself in those shoes a lot as I think about, if I were in the shoes, what would I be thinking about? What would I do? You know, I don't want to feel overwhelmed. I don't want to feel frustrated. So for me, taking it into digestible chunks is the best way to do it. So I'm asking you to think about your commitment to yourself, your commitment to your professional learning, your commitment to your students. And I want to think about what you're going to do today, what you're going to do tomorrow, what you're going to do in 30 days, what's going to happen in 60 days, what's going to happen in 90 days, and then, you know, next school year. What's this going to look like? But it's got to start today. It's got to start tomorrow with our thinking and our commitments. So I'm going to ask you to think about what you're going to do about learning more about the content standards. What's your plan for learning the shifts of instruction? What's your plan for expectations for assessment? How are you going to learn more about assessment? And finally, how are you going to modify your practices? So you've got all this information. I'm sure there are many questions, but I really encourage you to think about it in digestible chunks over time. And again, what your personal level of commitment is going to be starting today. Tony?
And Andrea, on that note, we've received 2 quick questions. I'm going to field the first and then turn the second over to you.
Okay.
Eileen asks, she states that we're in a smarter balance state, but she asks if it would be helpful to look at PARCC sample questions as well. Would we benefit from looking at both consortia? As we're talking about part of the leadership plan, I see that as hugely critical because these are so different than anything that we've seen previously. The more information that we have, the more we're going to see the necessary shifts, not only in how we measure students' understanding, but how we teach them to understand. And our instructional practices, the implications of these assessments are absolutely huge. Doug writes a question regarding to the scoring of constructed response items and asks what features will ensure that next generation assessments are scored promptly and consistently. Inter-rater reliability and quick turnaround. What do you know about that, Andrea?
That's a great question. So is this Brad asked it?
Doug.
Oh, Doug. Okay, so Doug, if you look at the released items, you can see the point value that's been assigned to those items. So anything that that we have seen that requires a student-produced product will generally have a rubric with it, as well as a point response. Now, that being said, there is the computer scoring, which is going to occur. And it's funny you ask this because I had a client just ask me a week ago the same question. There's also there's machine scoring, and there's also going to be some items that need to be humanly scored. And the details about that, I have not seen tremendously specific information about that, but there is going to be opportunity for some human scoring in there. What that looks like in inter-relator reliability, I'm sure those are areas that will be addressed and may already have some information on the websites about that. But it's anticipated that we get the results back quickly enough so that these assessments can be viewed as formative as well.
All right, and we've received a couple other questions about technology from Howie. Quick answer to your question, Howie, certainly tablets can support the shift and support us in moving to online assessments. School I'm working with in North Carolina, western part of the state, is doing that very successfully. Please feel free to reach out to me and I can share some more there. The balanced mathematics instruction, you're correct, Melissa, has not been released as of yet. But Kathy, I believe we can take pre-orders for that on our website. Is that correct?
Yes, we can. It will be. It's due to be released in August. But if you go to our website and go to our book section in the menu above, you can pre-order it. Thank you for asking that, Melissa.
Hey, Tony, can I add just one thing about the technology piece too?
Yes, ma'am.
Both consortia have put out a while ago technology specifications for school districts. And PARCC actually has a technology planner tool on their website. So if you're a principal or a teacher and you want to think about, you know, how many kids do I have, how many computers do I have, how many assessments am I going to be giving, you can plug all that in, and a formula will tell you about how many sessions you'll need and the length of time. So PARCC does have a planner on their website, but both have released the technology specs. Gosh, I want to say over a year ago, that information was made available to districts so they could plan for the technology.
All right, and folks, you see our contact information on the screen. Andrea and I will hang out. We're receiving some more questions here, but wanted to make sure to post our contact information if you have more in-depth questions beyond what we can answer here today, or would just like to follow up on our responses to your questions. Please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. Kathy, we okay to stay and field a few more questions?
We certainly are, and in fact, absolutely. And I do have one from before that I do not believe that we answered in regard to Karen's question about having if students have a scribe, how will they take the assessment?
Yes, missed that. Thank you.
I guess that one's for me.
Yeah,
sure. And I'm not certain of the answer to that. You know, normally as the students have accommodations in the classroom, we would expect that they would be available for the assessment. I haven't seen the very specifics on that yet, but again, PARCC and Smarter Balance both have frameworks that are on their website. I would encourage folks to look there. Or if they want to email me the question, I'll be happy to see if I can find the answer to that one.
Here's a great question from Ione. I hope Ione, I'm pronouncing that correctly. If not, I just did it again. But these questions are so involved. How can we address the patience and perseverance that students will need in this age of texting, social media, etc.? Boy, at the school that I mentioned earlier in the western part of North Carolina, this has been something that they've struggled with. And, you know, we made some transitions to more Common Core-like assessments as much as we could do given the technology limitations at the time, and perseverance was a huge issue. What I found is, in their case, what they would tell you is that feedback and opportunity for revision, conferencing with the kids about what they're doing well and what they need to work on to get better, and then giving them time and requiring them to resubmit the work has made a huge difference. We went from kids who literally would set the pencil down and refuse to do anything at the beginning of the year to kids who, on their district benchmark assessments, were just recently taking as much as 3 hours to complete their assessments because they gave every little bit of detail, every thought that they had about the question. So you're right to be aware of patience and persistence, and we need to take deliberate steps throughout the year to address that.
Can I add to that, Tony, too?
Yes, please.
It's as you said, you know, this doesn't happen overnight, and we have to be very patient as educators too. And the mathematical practices as practice standards, the habits of mind around the math, some of those standards actually do address perseverance and students' ability to connect with math in a real world way. So part of the challenge for teachers is to themselves make the learning more relevant and engaging for students in the modeling and the application piece. As we address more nonfiction and informational reading and writing, again, that's more authentic for kids, and they should be able to connect better. But this will take time. And you know, even in the 5 Easy Steps program for math, it's interesting that, you know, we know as we engage kids in authentic, real problem solving, it takes time, and we must give them entry points and access points to the learning. They have to experience success first. We need to engage them and give them success so we can hook them in and then take them to the levels that they need to go.
Two related questions here, Andrea. One from Howie, and I'll scroll down and find the other. Let's see, sorry. Will SBAC or Smarter Balance be providing online formative and interim assessments in addition to the annual summative? And then a similar question from, let's see, I had it just a second ago.
You want me to answer that one first while you look?
Yeah, please, sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. So Smarter Balance and PARCC both have optional assessments. PARCC, let's see, has an optional diagnostic and a mid-year for grades 3 through 8 and high school. And Smarter has an optional interim assessment, grades 3 through 12, and the Smarter Balanced ones do include performance tests. So information on those can also be found directly on their websites.
Okay. Do you know how the Common Core will be implemented into the new GED? Or do we have or able to provide professional development services? Jean, that sounds like a follow-up question. We'll get back with you about that one.
Yeah, because the Common Core is that college and career readiness trajectory, so we'd have to talk about what that looked like.
And are the optional assessments, diagnostic and mid-year for PARCC, definitely going to be available to the public in the 2014-15 year? I heard something about this not being available. That's from Sharon.
The information that I have directly from PARCC says there are optional optional diagnostic and mid-year for 3 through 8 and high school. So how those will be released to districts, those technicalities probably still remain to be worked out.
Okay, and I think the last question that we have here from John. John states that he's heard a lot of information about assessments and changes about the assessment, but he's not heard about how the results will be shared with teachers. What type of information will be shared so we can help teachers prepare the students for the upcoming assessments and standards?
So we know that the information will be released back to districts. Some of those reports, as I have learned just in my analysis of the information put out, some of those reports will be static and some of those reports we can manipulate. There will be reports released to parents, but that largely will be, the dissemination of those will largely be around district policies.
All right. Folks, please don't hesitate. Yep.
Tony, I do believe there is one more from Cheryl, and that may be one that we'll follow up later as well. Just looking for additional best practices information that they can follow that that we had indicated would be part of this webinar. And I know, Andrea, you talked a lot about next steps that people should be taking. But
yeah.
Additional best practices information is what.
Yeah, and I have to give a lot of credit to some of our authors at the center, particularly Larry Ainsworth, who developed the rigorous curriculum design process well in advance of Common Core. And it just seems like the assessment processes that we teach around common formative assessments and authentic performance tests are exactly what Common Core is looking like. So, in a webinar generally about assessments, we can't get too deeply into those, but we do offer professional development solutions around common formative assessments, which addresses short constructed as well as extended response and the authentic performance task piece. I hope that helps.
All right, I believe so. Again, folks, thanks for sticking with us and continuing to send these questions in. We know that we cannot provide all the information or answer all the questions that you have in this limited amount of time. Please feel free to reach out with us or look to our website for additional resources. Thanks for your time and attention today. We sincerely appreciate it. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you all.